Right, are we ready to start? Brains on, notepads out. Okay, nutrition. I remember when we had, come on, come sit down.
I'm just getting water.
Sure. I remember when we had Alan Aragon out, and one or two others. It was funny talking about, like, we talk about the politics in the fitness industry and the to and fro and the argument. It's worse again in the nutrition world. Like, and I feel genuinely bad for them. Like, sometimes I feel like I have it bad, and then I look at the stuff that they get. Like, look at like Spencer Nadolski, who we had out. Look at his Instagram. Like, he'll just make a blanket statement, like, you know, diet soda is probably not bad if you're diabetic or whatever. Jesus Christ. You just swear to God like he burned an effigy or something. So nutrition tends to be a tough field to walk through. And I think it's just because it's more emotionally charged for people. We have emotional attachments related to nutrition and food, right? Less so with training. Yes, it's usually an emotional crux for most of us, but we tend to be a little bit less emotional about people training differently to us. Whereas this tends to incite a lot of very, very strong opinions. So the two main camps we have are the hormone camp, right? Where hormones are the only thing that matter. You control them. You can do whatever you want, eat whatever you want. Calories are irrelevant. And then we have over here the calorie crew who say, absolutely does not matter. Pen is running out because pens hate me, apparently, during this event. Calories are the only thing that matter. And so long as we satisfy calorie demands in whatever way, then the outcome is completely irrelevant. Both are wrong, both are right. Because is it ever that simple? No. This, on the strictest sense, is correct. You cannot break physics. The whole like, oh, I tried this diet and it didn't work. You weren't in a deficit or surplus, whatever. You cannot, like, if you've broken the law of thermodynamics, we're going to study you because no one has. Then the whole universe will fall apart. So this is true and this is true. Yes, we need a calorie deficit to lose fat. Yes, we need a calorie surplus to gain weight. Do we need it to build muscle? Tiny bit more contentious, but we can safely say a small surplus is beneficial towards hypertrophy. However, if this diet plan that is set at a certain amount of calories with different macro splits or whatever affects this, then it's going to affect how we feel, how likely we are to follow the diet, maybe what type of tissue we gain or lose, how much food we get to eat for the amount of calories that we get, leptin, insulin, cortisol, adrenaline, even testosterone and estrogen, glutamate, all can be affected by what makes up the calories that we eat. So once again, kind of like we spoke about with the training, the very first section we did on the nervous system, when we think training, we always think muscle system, when in reality, you could argue focusing on the nervous system first is potentially more important, okay? So this is going to be a little bit of both, but we kind of all know this. We know how to track calories, but really the success lies here to a degree because that's the bit we just don't really know how to fiddle with to get the response we want, okay? So this is just an example of how we can affect different hormones and neurotransmitters. Really, this should say hormone/neurotransmitters, but it's not as catchy when you're making a 30-second Instagram post, so we just say hormones, right? If we go with a lower carb diet, that could be keto, but generally we're just speaking lower carb, higher fat, higher protein. We get more dopamine, okay? Reason being, protein and fat are eaten together. You absorb more tyrosine as opposed to tryptophan because they use the same carrier. When more carbs are present, that reverses. More tyrosine means more L-DOPA, which means more dopamine, okay? As a result, we get more noradrenaline because how do we create noradrenaline? Dopamine gets converted through. We get more adrenaline because low carb means low blood sugar. Again, adrenaline is not a bad thing, right? We get more GABA because low carb will increase the enzyme that converts glutamate to GABA. It's very simple. We get more acetylcholine, which if there's any neurotransmitter that we all could benefit from more of, it's that. This is the neurotransmitter that makes the natural athletes natural athletes. This is it right here. It's improved motor learning, improved cognition, improved memory storage, improved memory retrieval. All the stuff that makes you jealous of either natural athletes or people who are naturally good learners happens here. It also spares adrenaline. The more acetylcholine you have, the less adrenaline you need to release to achieve the same job. Why? Because it does almost the same thing. It will be a vasodilator. It can increase heart rate. It can increase muscle contraction strength. So you don't need to increase this if you have a lot of this. So generally they're less stressed, more stress resilient, more tolerant. Low carb will increase cortisol because that's how we increase adrenaline. It also increases the activity of the AMPK pathway. How this is generally looked at is mTOR is over here. AMPK is over here, right? And I'm sorry for the pen being shit. And it's basically like, this is the devil that wants to steal all your gains. This is where we want to be. Is it ever that simple? No. Yes, low carb diets, cardiovascular work, endurance work, etc. stimulate this pathway. But a lot of the adaptations that this creates, improved mitochondrial function, better capillary bed and etc., better oxygen handling, allows us to stimulate this more. It's just that they can't both be high at the same time. So when we see that and we say more AMPK, sure, right now, that being higher, not good for your muscular gains. Long term, you don't do this, you end up running into rate limiting factors in this because the foundation hasn't been set by it. So if you want to be jacked, do your cardio. It is that simple. Things that get decreased on a low carb diet, serotonin. So people who have naturally low serotonin already, maybe naturally anxious individuals, will deplete it more, and they usually struggle to sleep. They feel more stressed, so on and so forth. Glutamate gets released. And we also see reductions in IGF-1 and mTOR, which is why, all else being equal, when we talk about dieting or how we should eat for hypertrophy, more carbs is generally better because carb intake directly stimulates mTOR and IGF-1. So we want them, but how much for each individual is going to differ, but all else being equal, this is what we want. Higher carb diet, more basically just flip, right? More mTOR, more IGF-1, good for hypertrophy. More serotonin, which could be good or bad, depending on your profile. More glutamate, however, which over time can become neurotoxic. If you already have high glutamate, you already have a lot of blue light exposure, you eat a lot of processed food, you have a lot of glutamic acid, MSG in your diet, that could push you to a point where you start getting the mood swings, the inhibited cognition, all that type of thing. And then we see decreases in all of these things. Huge decrease in adrenaline, because if your blood sugar is always reasonably high, you have no need to release cortisol and adrenaline. You see higher acetylcholine and noradrenaline and dopamine because we're not depleting them to create as much adrenaline. So there are positives and negatives to both. It is never, this is the way to be. So like here you have the keto zealots, right? They naturally have a brain chemistry that does well on this. Then you've got all the high carb people, or maybe someone who's naturally anxious, things like that. They would be over here saying, this is the worst diet ever. This makes me feel great.
Does acetylcholine have an antagonist?
Antagonist? No. It's acetylcholine is like the star player when it comes to neurology. If we're talking like motor learning or really just any cognition, more we can drive that up, the better. No one really responds badly to it, which is why things like alpha GPC and citicoline or just choline in general is generally pretty well responded to by everyone, because that's what leads to acetylcholine, for example. Okay, so how do we go about gaining muscle? Okay, so 1 pound of muscle requires about 220 grams of protein to make, okay? However, what percentage of protein that you intake that physically goes in your mouth do you think in a person who's training regularly actually ends up in muscle tissue? 20%? 0.5%, okay. Any other guesses? We're generally looking at less than 10%. We're lucky if we're usually sitting in 8 to 10% range. That's in someone who is more muscular than average. We're assuming a trained individual who is training regularly right now. So there is reason to send protein to that area. So based on that, actually, how much do we need to ingest? 2,200 grams, give or say 2 to 3,000 grams of protein to actually get a pound of muscle tissue on the body. Sounds like a lot, but let's also think about how quickly you can actually gain muscle. This probably isn't the rate limiting factor unless your diet's pretty low in protein. Because let's say it takes you a month to put on 1 pound of muscle, which you'd be doing really well to do. What's your daily intake times that by 30? You're probably doing okay. You'd be amazed at how little you can eat and still be fine. But there are going to be individual factors here that determine how easily we gain muscle with that being equal, which is going to be based on how naturally anabolic you are, for want of a better way of putting it. There are going to be some people naturally have very high mTOR activation, naturally high testosterone, high IGF-1. You can see it on blood panels. Just take people, again, people who have had no assistance, no PED use, just take all their sex hormones and IGF-1. They're going to differ massively. There are going to be some people that have IGF-1 levels through the roof. And there are going to be some people that have testosterone levels that are higher than some people who take exogenous testosterone, right? They have a naturally high anabolic environment. So their diet doesn't necessarily need to be pushing those anabolic pathways as hard because the environment it's in play in is better. Then on the polar opposite end of that spectrum, you're going to have people naturally have high AMPK, low testosterone, low IGF-1. Well, they don't have that great environment. So if we can create a diet that actually pushes those factors in our favor, that's going to be more important for them. Whereas for this person over here, who's, so we say, got blessed genetically, not so important. Okay, so this is what a calorie surplus does, just regardless of how the macros are made up, how we go about it in terms of meal frequency, whatever. IGF-1 and mTOR go up. T3 goes up. T3 goes up because remember, if adrenaline and cortisol are high, conversion of T4 to T3 goes down. Basal metabolic rate goes down. If we're in a surplus, generally cortisol and adrenaline will be lower. That conversion is less inhibited. And leptin goes down, which basically says the body is well fed. So your hunger signals drop. You can, though, develop leptin resistance. If you become leptin resistant, which is what you see in most obese people. You don't respond to your own leptin. You start getting hunger signals when there shouldn't be hunger signals, which is why the person who's 300 pounds or whatever, 40% body fat, is still really hungry because they've become resistant to that leptin. That's a big part of the problem. That's why, for example, just saying to a heavily overweight person, just eat less, isn't really the whole picture, right? What we see in a decrease, cortisol and adrenaline, AMPK, but insulin sensitivity goes down. All else being equal, blood glucose is going to be higher on average in a surplus than in a deficit, which means insulin on average will be higher, which over time will lead to insulin sensitivity coming down, both globally and at the muscle tissue level. This comes later, but it's important because what are we trying to grow? Muscle tissue. Localized sensitivity is important just as much as global. For example, things like PCOS, in truth, are an insulin sensitivity issue at the ovarian tissues. That's why they have the inflammation-based problems and all this type of thing. It leads to very specific problems in very specific areas. The same thing happening at a muscle level is going to mean less glycogen storage, less anabolic pathways activated, so on and so forth. So all of these things sound great at first, but over time, this becomes a key factor in should I continue to gain? Should I continue to be in a surplus? Or is this where the thing, like the idea of diet breaks comes from? Do you strictly need a diet break? Probably not. But like everything, like with training, you get a point of diminishing returns where if this goes down, then you might still be gaining tissue, but what tissue are you gaining? If that ratio is shifting towards fat, which is only going to further reduce insulin sensitivity, increase inflammation, it becomes a negative downward spiral, but the scale is still going in the direction you want. So is it really just calories at that point? Okay, so this is what we see then in a deficit. The polar opposite. IGF-1, mTOR, T3, leptin, testosterone can come down. That would be towards the tail end of a dieting phase when there's a pretty severe diet in place, right? So bad for muscle gain, obviously, right? But just because these are lower does not mean you cannot gain muscle, right? We see people gain muscle in a deficit all the time. It happens. But we have now created an environment in terms of hormones, neurotransmitters, etc., that are just less favorable for hypertrophy, okay? So this is what we see here. Increased appetite due to leptin coming down. The body perceives it as less well fed. This is what happens when you get pro bodybuilders close to shows. Leptin goes down and down and down because body fat stores are getting lower. The body is saying, this is a bad place to be. You need to go eat. That's why hunger goes through the roof and why it's so difficult, right? Which is why most people will never get to 5% body fat or whatever it might be. If you could take a pill to control leptin tomorrow, getting ripped would be pretty easy for all of us, okay? But we do see an increase in insulin sensitivity, both at the global and muscular level, depending on how long the deficit is. So we've been talking about training sensitivity. Insulin sensitivity is going to be the diet equivalent. If we can regain insulin sensitivity, now we can probably go into a gaining phase again and be responsive to it. The other thing that we're going to see at first is increased alertness. When most people start a dieting phase, after a long gaining phase, or they go on something like the keto diet where carbs are low and adrenaline, cortisol comes up, first couple of weeks, they feel fucking awesome. You ask anyone who's been surplus for a year and they just cut their calories down, first 4 weeks, they feel amazing. Why didn't I do this sooner? More adrenaline in the system. But we've already discussed how that will probably be short-lived because of the downregulation we can see if it's too extreme. But it does play into it the fact that if someone is very adrenaline sensitive, the person who loves coffee, energy drinks, etc., they're going to feel pretty good in a small deficit. And they may want to stay there for a longer period of time. And they might actually feel less energetic, less motivated in a surplus. So these are the 4 typical strategies that people would use when we're talking about gaining muscle, right? We've got the old school bulking method, right? And I really wish that term would die, but it's still there. Eat big to get big, bulk, whatever. It's usually a large surplus, 500 calories or more over your maintenance. Problem is that even for an enhanced individual, even for a beginner, the ratio of fat gain to muscle gain is going to be pretty bad. This is fine if you don't care about that. If you're really good at dieting down, maybe it's not an issue, but then you're wasting time dieting when maybe you don't have to, okay? If you're, say, regaining muscle that you've already lost, something like that, maybe this can be a good strategy. Or if you're someone who's underweight and has now just stepped in the weight, you know, the typical skinny teenager getting in the gym for the first 6 months, that's probably good for them because they're going to be growing at a rate that's appropriate. This is probably where most people should be. What would be called lean bulking, okay? Just a couple of 100 calories, right? Remember, if we're going to gain like a pound of muscle tissue a month, and that is assuming, I hate to break it to you, but this is assuming you're doing everything right, training really hard, perfect diet, perfect sleep, very low life stress, have a good kind of natural hormonal environment. That might be where you get there for a while at the beginning. And then probably after the first year of training, you're not getting that. So if you're 5 years into your training, you ain't getting anywhere close. So really, how much of a calorie surplus do we need? So now you see all the kind of, right now the in vogue thing is you don't need a surplus, right, to gain muscle. Technically it's true. But again, we're kind of going back to what we were talking about with hypertrophy, is that it's just happening on such a small, slow scale. You probably do need a surplus. At least it will help. But the amount of surplus, or the quantity of surplus you need is going to be fractional compared to what we maybe used to think that's going to be, unless you're happy just piling on more fat. And even in this scenario, the average person will probably gain as much fat as they do muscle if they're in a couple of 100 calories of a surplus. So again, this kind of The idea of being like, my cut is over, I'm going to add 1,000 calories to my intake. Absolutely no need at all. Then we have what main gaining. It's called a couple of different things. Most people know what I mean when I say that. It's eating the tiniest slither of a surplus, usually at maintenance, but maybe just a tiny bit above, or like kind of maintenance or even just below on rest days, and then a tiny bit above on training days. The weekly average turns out kind of just above. Again, this is probably where most people should be, but the downside of this is if you're not in a meaningful surplus, this whole anabolic environment here with like mTOR, IGF-1, MGF is not going to get stimulated as well. So your natural kind of anabolic environment, should we say, is not going to be as favorable. So you will probably sacrifice some muscle gains. But if that comes at the cost with the effect of not really having to diet, if over a long enough time period, that may be a better strategy, because you don't waste 8 weeks of dieting. Maybe you diet for 2 weeks. So if you spend 6 weeks more in a surplus, maybe overall the net gain is better. And then last but not least, we have recomping, which in truth doesn't really happen most of the time. What all people don't think it's happening when it's not. What usually happens here is they really, 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 really slowly lose fat whilst keeping all the muscle they have. They don't really gain any muscle, right? We've all seen people lose 10 pounds and look bigger just because they have more definition. They perceive that as muscle gain, and that's fine. But what's probably happening under the hood, if we had a truly accurate way of measuring lean body mass, would be muscle tissue has stayed the same. So technically percentage muscle tissue has gone up. That's fine. That's not a bad thing, but they're not really gaining to any real degree there. If they've, say, lost muscle tissue previously, they're using anabolic steroids, various other factors can come in. Well, that may mean they do gain a bit of muscle, but it's going to be pretty insignificant compared to what they could have gained in the same time period. So, welcome to depression. How much muscle can I gain, right? And it's way, way over exaggerated. Again, if you know any competitive bodybuilders, ask them how much stage weight they put on in a year. Let's assume they're on drugs, right? No, let's just assume that, because most are. Even there. And remember, their only goal is hypertrophy. They're not like a powerlifter trying to get stronger. Like, oh, dude, I'm going to do 4 weeks of growth, like growing phase hypertrophy training after my meet. Great. What do you think that's going to do? This person trains for hypertrophy all year round and puts on 2 pounds in a year. And you think you're going to put on 2 pounds in a month after a meet because you did some curls. And now you're doing sets of 8 rather than sets of 5. Just doesn't happen. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that play into how much. But when you see these crazy transformations and people look like they've created a crazy amount of muscle in less time, this is what we're looking at. Steroid usage, maybe ramping it up or not having any experience and then using it for the first time. Genetic outliers, it does happen. Some people are just crazy responsive to training, right? People like Sergio Oliva, right? If you don't know who he is, he was basically head and head with Arnold at the time. He had a brother, he said, in Cuba, who worked on a sugarcane farm, who was as jacked as he was and had never stepped foot in a gym, just used a scythe and farming tools, right? That's going to be a pretty impressive physique. And he has even lifted. Imagine if that guy lifted, okay? We're going to mistake these things here for muscle gain, water retention, glycogen store. You go from being in a diet, permanently flat, permanently retaining water, which is blurring your definition because of cortisol and adrenaline are high. You go high carb for a week. What happens? You drop the subcutaneous water, your muscles fill up with glycogen, and you look jacked by comparison. You look like you just did the best steroid cycle ever in a week, right? That's there. We can see regaining lost muscle, which happens very quickly because the satellite cells and the structures are already in place. And most of the time it's actually this. It's angles, it's posing, it's lighting, it's dehydrating for a photo shoot to make you look better than you actually do every other day. That's where we see what we perceive as large gains in muscle tissue. But in truth, it's not really happening. So this is where we're at. In your entire training career, the average male will gain about 30 to 40 pounds of dry muscle tissue. So let's say you could take your body at say 21 that has never stepped foot in a gym and is 10% body fat. You could probably put about this much muscle on top of that frame in your entire training career. For women, that's going to be about half, all else being equal. Okay? Now, what we need to remember is that's dry muscle tissue. When we have muscle tissue, it's not just the protein element, right? There's glycogen, triglycerides, water, electrolytes, all these things. So generally for every pound of dry muscle tissue that we have, 50 to 100% extra scale weight comes with it, with all of those things. So that 30 pounds could be 45 to 60, and that 80 could be 60 to up as much as even 80 actual scale weight. And again, for women, that could push them up as high as 40 pounds of scale weight, or maybe as low as like 22. Okay? So there's a difference between lean tissue and pure muscle tissue, but the scale is the important part here that we're looking at. That's in your entire training career. Okay? Now, similar to the analogy we had the other day about the powerlifting competitors, their first 2 years, they put about 10% on, and then it's like 1 or 2%. You see a very similar thing. The first 2 years, 1 or 2 years, you're gonna get a pretty enhanced rate here. Some people will get to half this in the first 2 years. And then it takes them 10 years to get the other 50% or more. Most never get to that limit. Okay? We're not doing these things well enough to actually get to that limit. And then once we get to the advanced stage, we've been training for 5 years plus. And when I say training, I mean sensibly, with hypertrophy in mind. We're looking at 2 to 3 pounds a year for a woman and 3 to 4 pounds a year for a guy. Muscle tissue gain. That's it. Now that will show up as a little bit more on the scale, as we just alluded to, but that is in a whole year. And people underestimate that, right? But if you put on, let's say, 5 or 6 pounds of lean tissue, so 4 pounds of muscle, actual muscle tissue, and your family didn't see you for a year, you would look very different. You know, go and buy 6 pounds of lean beef mince and do a Lady Gaga and spread it across your body and see what that does to the definition of your body, right? It's a lot. It's a lot of gain. And again, look at a competitive bodybuilder year to year, stage weight of 4 pounds difference. It's noticeable. You can see that very much so. So don't underestimate. It sounds really depressing, but actually what those 3 or 4 pounds represent on a human being is a lot more than we think.
Where did the 8 to 10% of what you eat in terms of muscle come from then?
This is the amount of amino acids or protein that you ingest actually goes to muscle tissue from tissue repair and growth.
Most of it's repair, though, right?
Most of it will be repair. And this is like at best, right? When these studies are...
You get like 400,000 grams of protein a year. You're only going to gain.
Yeah, because this is rare. My point why I said that is because protein intake is rarely the limiting factor, right? But this is also presuming when they do these studies and they can basically put little markers on the protein and they can see where the protein goes in the body, so on and so forth. That's when they're using whey protein, which it is near as damn the most bioavailable protein that we have readily available, right? It's like 90+% with egg, okay? Now, you imagine that's soy or pea protein, right? That drops massively. And then instead of 10% going there, we've got 5 or 4, right? So even that is going to change the dynamic. But even if that was the case, and this was more like 5%, across a year, protein intake probably isn't the limiting factor. Probably. But that doesn't mean that we don't need more protein. Because if you think about this, right? If your protein is too low, muscle is not the only thing that needs protein. There's a reason only 10% of it goes to muscle. It's not because the rest just gets excreted or we don't want to use it. The body is using the rest for organ repair, everything else that goes on, right? So it's not really the rate limiting factor, but if we don't have enough, do you think the body is going to put protein in muscle over an organ? Probably not, right? So it isn't a problem. But this is why now, and we'll talk about the studies on protein intake, it's also going to depend on how much muscle you have, your insulin sensitivity, how hard you're training, because all of that is going to create a signal of what should preferentially be sent to the muscle, if that makes sense. You know, someone who has more muscle tissue is probably going to get a higher rate of delivery. Someone who's training hard is going to get a higher rate of delivery. Someone who has better muscle insulin sensitivity is going to have a higher rate of delivery, so on and so forth. But this is the depressing truth. So next time you think about where you want to be in terms of hypertrophy, this. Because I say this because we have an entire male audience, right? But every male thinks they should be able to be 200 pounds and ripped. Like every male thinks 200 pounds and like 8% is totally doable, right? Why? There are plenty of men's physique athletes out there who are like 6 foot, 6'1" on stage, or like sub 190 or mid 190s. Look at someone like Jeff Seed, who was probably the first big name that people kind of associate with in that. I think he was 6 foot or 6'1" and about 198 on stage. And he like blew the doors off that category. So what makes you think you're going to be 200 pounds and 7%, right? It's just a misconception. There's nothing wrong with being 180, 190 pounds or whatever, if that's your goal. We just have some weird skewed perception because what do we get shown? The top 1%, 99% of what we get shown is that. So this is stolen directly from Alan Aragon. And it's a pretty good idea to give us a rough guide for how much scale weight we should be gaining, right? Because now we can look at it in terms of percentage body weight. We can expect about half the rate of muscle gain in women, so that's why there's this discrepancy here. And obviously we expect less as we become more advanced because the rate of muscle gain will slow down. If you're here, you're probably here. You've been training for 5 years or more. 0.2% of your body weight per month. This is also assuming that you're not 40% body fat and you're 350 pounds, right? This is assuming you're in a reasonably sensible body fat percentage. 0.2% of your body weight per month. What does that equate to for you? Just do the math in your head. That's how slow it should be. Unless you just want to gain fat for the sake of gaining fat, which is fine, but don't lie to yourself that you're gaining more muscle than you are. So when you see this, bulking kind of becomes dead. Why would you want to gain a pound every week? What purpose is that serving for you in this scenario? We're talking about hypertrophy specifically. Or think about the ratio of fat to muscle gain if you were to gain a pound even every 2 weeks there. It's a horrible ratio. Which is why most people end up in this horrible cycle of, if we think about this, right? If the surplus is too high, let's say 500 calories a day. This is why a lot of people are spinning their wheels, right? We go in with a surplus of 500 calories a day, which means probably for every 5 pounds of scale weight, we might gain half a pound of muscle tissue because of the rate that we're gaining it, the tissue at. How long does your bulk last before you get too fat and you're not happy? 3 months, right? Let's go back to the slide. If your bulk lasted 3 months as an advanced athlete, how much muscle tissue have you actually gained? Maybe 1% of your body weight, if you're lucky, in 3 months, right? Then you've put on more than that, let's say 8 pounds of fat. You now have to diet off 8 pounds of fat. Let's not lie to ourselves. We're probably going to lose a little bit of muscle tissue when we do that, right? And dieting off that 8 pounds might take 2 months. So now in 5 months, we've gained 3 pounds of muscle and maybe lost half of it dieting off the extra fat that we didn't need to put on. So in 5 months, we've gained maybe 1.5 pounds. That's probably being generous also. So it's a perception problem. We rush the bulk, rush the cut, and end up not really getting the results of either, and end up in this vicious cycle where we're not really making progress at all. Whereas if this was cut down to, let's say 200, and was done for 6, 7, 8 months, now we're talking. Now the time frame is actually long enough to gain some muscle, and we won't have to diet for as long afterwards, which is why you'll have people like Justin Harris, who've been on the podcast a bunch of times. He will say gaining phases are like minimum 16 to 20 weeks, and then you should only need to diet for maximum half, more like a third or a quarter of that. Do like a mini diet break, mini cut. Then you go for 16 to 20 weeks again. then you might do an actual diet phase then, because you've had 32 to 40 weeks of actual gaining time. Now you have something to uncover. But most of us don't want to do that. But that's where the reality is. So, how much protein do we actually need? We only get to send at most 10% of it to our muscle. This is where all the studies have come out, right? This seems to be the unanimous figure that's thrown around right now. 1.6 grams per kilo of body weight. Now, there are many factors here, as we can see. Obviously, how much muscle you have is a big factor in that. If you have more muscle to feed and more muscle damage because you're training and more muscle is being trained, you're probably going to need more protein. If your carb intake is higher, then more of the protein that you intake will be spared. Protein is often taken and used to create glucose. Look up gluconeogenesis, which is why in super low carb diets, a lot of your protein gets lost to that, which is also why in a dieting phase, you would argue that your protein needs to be proportionally higher. If carbs and calories are lower, more of your protein intake will be lost to create glucose. Stress will mean adrenaline and cortisol are higher. And also the quality. We discussed most of the studies are on whey protein. If we're eating brown rice protein, pea protein, their bioavailability can be 50%, 50, 60%, compared to 90 to 100 in like whey, egg, that type of thing. If you've only got 50% bioavailability, what needs to happen to your protein intake compared to someone who eats only whey? It's going to need to be double, give or take, right? Like that's you. So this is, when people discuss the issues of a vegan diet, protein intake, not necessarily the problem. Totally doable. It's harder when you're dieting because the calorie intake's higher and all of their protein sources come with carbs or fats. But this is the problem. Every gram they take in is half a gram compared to something like an egg protein. So not only is it harder for them to get protein, their requirements significantly higher because of that bioavailability problem, okay? So when we see this thrown around, 1.6 grams per kilogram, right? Let's just put this up here for now. Oh, gram. And again, pens seem to hate me for some reason. This is what you've seen in meta-analyses. So meta-analyses take lots of studies, put them together, aggregate all the results. Let's see what the average is, right? This creates something called, I've got it written on there, but Simpson's paradox, which is basically what happens it's a statistical anomaly theory, whatever. What happens is, it's broken anyway. We see patterns in this group, we see patterns in this group, we see patterns in this group. Then we do our meta-analysis, we add them together, the pattern disappears. Why is that? Well, let's think about the studies that these are taking place on. What demographic are most diet, lifting, hypertrophy-based studies done on? Untrained, beginners. Yeah, right? So first off, we've got a population that probably isn't representative of the people who actually want this information. They have less muscle tissue to feed, which, as we've just discussed, is going to change your protein requirement. Now, we do have some decent studies done on advanced trainees, and those studies particularly show increased protein synthesis and increased growth rates at 2 grams per kilo, 2.2 grams per kilo, 2.4 grams per kilo of lean body mass, key factor. And the only reason we don't have evidence more than that is because they stopped there. But it was an almost linear relationship to that point. So 2.4 grams per kilogram of lean body mass was the highest they went to, but that was still giving almost linear returns. So then we go back to the whole, just eat 1 gram per pound. Maybe we didn't get there by accident, right? Maybe that actually kind of matters, especially if you're someone who's training, right? So this is the important thing when we're looking at these studies. Who are they on? What are they doing? How hard are they training? So on and so forth. There is no reason to believe that those higher levels of protein intake will not lead to higher levels of gains, hypertrophy, whatever, in the correct population. If you're a beginner, you probably don't need that intake because you don't have as much muscle tissue to repair, you're not creating as much muscle damage, so on and so forth. Does that make sense? If you are, and if you just really want to water it down, if you are a person who is proportionally made of more protein than someone who is untrained, it makes sense that you need proportionally more protein. Kind of makes sense, right? So,
seems to actually then be probably a couple of curves, or who knows how far it goes linear before it kind of hits,
absolutely.
hits that asymptote. But then you would have to almost divide it right into your natural versus your anabolic.
Yes, you would.
Supplementation.
Yeah, absolutely. So just because we don't have evidence as such, there is some evidence out there. But as you can imagine, trying to take advanced trainees and say, hey, can we fuck with your diet for 3 months and see what happens? And you're going, no, I got a show in 3 months, right? That's why it's hard to come across data like that. But the ones that we do have, we just see that. So 1 gram per pound is probably reasonable. And when did that come about? When did that get decided? Decades ago, right? So this means that we now probably are going to benefit from more protein than the current kind of meta-analyses, studies, etc. tell us. Now, how do we split that up? Okay, so how many times should we eat per day? That becomes the next question, right? How much protein can, you can't have more than 30 grams at a time, then it just gets lost in the ether, right? And again, meta-analysis by Brad Schoenfeld showed that protein intake per meal capped at 0.4 grams per kilo. So a 100 kilo person could only eat 40 grams in a serving without the rest being lost to oxidation. But again, who is the target, right? Same people that gave us that average. If you don't have a protein-rich diet, all the enzymes that are responsible for digesting protein are going to be at a lower level compared to you guys who eat high protein-rich diets. All those enzymes get upregulated. If you have more muscle tissue to feed, they're all going to be upregulated. You're going to be better at handling protein than someone who is untrained and also eats low protein most of the time. Protein is the hardest macronutrient to find. If we're talking, cavemen-esque, right, context. Do you really think that if you killed a deer, your body at 40 grams would go, nope, done? Let's just be realistic. Like, evolution's a little bit smarter than that, right? But this is the problem. A lot of the information we're getting is general population. And we're different organisms. And I'm not saying that we're not superior, it's not whatever. It's just physiologically we are different. In the same way that a person who is on supplements, anabolic steroids, whatever, is also a different physiological being to someone who is not. They're very, very different. So again, these types of things are probably leading us in the wrong direction. And again, one came out the other day, and maybe last week, that said, now they've seen that up to 100 grams of protein could be ingested in a meal without running into it being lost to oxidation. And again, I believe the reason they settled on 100 grams is because that's just where they tested to. And that was in more fit individuals who had a protein-rich diet. You can see where I'm going with this, right? So it becomes almost obvious that most of these guidelines are wrong when you start to think, well, okay, trained individuals can maybe eat 1 gram per pound of body weight in protein and experienced increased growth. So let's say 200-pound individual, 200 grams. But this person can't ingest more than 40 grams at a time. So if that were true, how would that person get enhanced growth rates if they were eating 200 grams a day? You know what I mean? Meals don't just magically disappear out of your gut 2 hours later, right? Even if you're eating 5 meals a day, there's still some of meal 1 in you when you eat meal 2. It's not these completely separate incidents, right? You would get no benefit if this were true. So again, it just helps to reframe things in your head. Okay, calorie requirements. So that probably makes things less clear on protein. But what I'm saying is, the old adage of 1 gram per pound is probably accurate if you're training hard and if you have more muscle tissue than the average person. The more muscular you become, the longer you eat a protein-rich diet, the more protein you will be able to handle. Simple as that, okay? Now, when you see these, just take it with a pinch of salt, remembering who they are studying, okay? Again, I love science. I am a nerd. I read these studies because I want to, but there's also definitely a place for what are all the really jacked people doing, right? What has led to their results for decades upon decades, way higher than we have ever found evidence for. Maybe there's something to it, right? So let's look at calorie requirements now, because in reality, most of the time, the way you're going to structure as a diet is you're going to set your protein target first, because that's the variable we don't want to fuck with, right? Doesn't matter if we're cutting, doesn't matter if we're gaining, we always need enough protein. Everything else kind of works around it then. Our total calories will be determined of whether we want to gain weight, lose weight, and then even the carbs and fats then will just be dictated first by how many of our calories are taken up by protein. It's just the one unwavering principle. So let's look at calories next. Now, there's a lot of factors going on here. Main one is body composition. Okay, obviously muscle tissue is more active than fat tissue. Fat tissue is not inert. It does have its own metabolic rate. It does burn. And also carrying it around also burns calories. So there's that to take into consideration. There's a huge variance in just metabolic rate on an individual level, all else being equal as well, related to thyroid metabolism and a bunch of other genetic factors, okay? This is the main one that you're going to run into when you're writing plans for people or even taking yourself, your previous dieting experience. We went back and discussed all these things here that are affected by your diet, right? T3, T4 metabolic rate is on here, okay? So if you take someone who is a chronic dieter, they have probably had some kind of suppressed metabolic rate for a long period of time. That doesn't just magically come back. In the same way, someone who's been in a surplus and building up their intake for a very long period of time probably has a higher than average metabolic intake. That's fine, but it matters. If the best information you can get from a client to know how many calories they need is what are you eating now and what is happening to the scale when you eat this much. Yes, we'll go over guidelines, but that is the best information you have. Then obviously we have activity level, which regular activity affects it way more than training. People think I train, therefore my metabolic rate will be high. If you're a desk jockey and all you do is train for 1 hour, 4 times a week, your metabolic rate will be much less than someone who has a physically active job who probably doesn't train. NEAT, whatever you want to call it, step count, walking, or even being stood as opposed to sat down all day makes way more of a difference here. Again, which one of the big factors when you're trying to diet people down, Gen Pop, whatever, is they just need to move more because this pushes the needle way more than their chest and biceps session will. So that becomes way more important. Then we also have things like the thermic effect of food. Obviously protein, more of the energy is lost to the thermic effect of food than carbs. Carbs, more of it is lost than fat. We have the bioavailability of the foods that we eat. And then we also have things like fiber intake, which don't really count if it's insoluble, so on and so forth. Okay, so as a catch-all, if you don't know the person's diet history, and they're within the realms of normal body fat percentage, this will put most people in the right ballpark. 12 to 13 calories per body weight in pounds. For most people will put you in a... Remember, when you start a diet with someone or even yourself, the initial diet plan is just really there to see what happens. Then you adjust from there. It's like if someone hires you to be their coach for nutrition, they're not paying you for the initial diet plan. And almost anyone could write that. There's enough information out there now that they could do that, right? You can just Google 2,000 calorie diet, right? What they're paying you for is the diet plan you write, how that then gets adjusted week by week based on how they respond to it. This is a good estimate for someone who has just a normal office job, average body fat percentage, and trains a handful of times a week. Most of the time, that's going to put you in a ballpark where you don't have to adjust it massively after that initial 1 or 2 week phase. Does that make sense?
That's for maintenance.
That would be maintenance, yes. But that's where you'd start. Because let's say we're way off. and we're about to start a dieting or even a gaining phase, if you start calories too high in a gaining phase, you're just going to put fat on at the beginning. If you start with calories too low, because you just like, right, let's go in a deficit straight away, and you massively underestimated their metabolic rate. They're in like a 800 calorie deficit from week 1. You've got less wiggle room to bring it down over time. So your best thing always is find maintenance first and then work from there in 90% of cases. If you do this and they lose 1 or 2 pounds in the first week or two, cool. We just hit the nail on the head straight away. If they go 0 change, great. I know how to adjust, so on and so forth from there. Even if they gained a little bit, that's still probably a better place to start their dieting down from, if that were the goal, okay? Now remember, when we do change the diet, there's going to be a lot of fluctuation at first, especially if they're eating really poorly to start, right? There's going to be, if they're eating a lot of processed food, pizzas, fast food, etc., there's going to be a lot of water retention, gut issues, so on and so forth. They might just drop a whole bunch of weight just from cleaning up their diet, even if the calories are the same, right? And you see that. Person can go from 3,000 calories of McDonald's to 3,000 calories of, let's call it clean food. We hate the word, but we know what it means. And they might drop 5 or 6 pounds just from inflammation and water retention. That doesn't play into your calculations for dieting, right? That's why you follow it for, let's say, 10 to 14 days. Now you've got some information after that point. Now the washout period has happened. Now you can make actual adjustments. Obviously, if they lose 10 pounds, you need to take that in consideration. But that first week, that scale's going to be doing this based on how much the diet has changed, which is why I prefer to do, is the pen going to work? Weekly average when you're tracking weight. Step on the scale every single day, take the average for the week, compare last week to this week, because it gets rid of those fluctuations. Like you went out for a nice meal on the Saturday night, you ate something that was saltier than usual, you drank a couple of beers, your weight goes up 3 pounds the next morning. I'm not losing weight, I need to bring my calories down. The rest of the week, you might have been in a -1 pound situation. And now you adjust your calories based on 1 reading. Just helps even out all those fluctuations. That is way more accurate. The only reason everyone doesn't do that, people have a stigma about stepping on the scale. That simple. But that, if you're serious about tracking body composition or weight accurately, that would be what you'd do. Now, back to gaining. These would be roughly where you'd put your calories. So if 12 to 13 times body weight in calories is maintenance for average Joe, this would be what the strategies would look like. And again, this exists unless they're an underweight beginner. I don't think it should ever really be used. It's usually just used as an excuse to eat shit and eat more than you want. This would be where most people should be. You have a question?
I do.
Yes, please.
So you kind of, the 12 to 13 by body weight in pounds, calories and everything, and, then you see how your clients are doing. But one of the things is I found is, let's say you have them keep a food diary, and then you really push them, because it's not matching up. Food diaries, when you ask people to keep them, they tend to forget a certain percentage,
The glass of wine every night or whatever, yeah.
I didn't count the stuff I drank that had, 100 calories a serving, or they'll forget some little snack they had on the run, and so how do you work with that when you're trying to say, okay, I'm under the impression that you're in this 12 to 13. We've been doing it for a couple of weeks, right? Something doesn't seem to be working, but the unknown is, how honest are you being with telling me that you're actually ingesting?
Yes.
Do you
So
use a fudge factor adjustment or something when you work with
sure. This is why, if I don't know a person, obviously, and we'll talk about this later. Someone wanted to talk about coaching skills. Can't remember who, sorry, but we'll do it. When I don't know someone and have a decent relationship with them, I will always give them, unless they're really vehemently against it, an actual meal plan as opposed to macros at first, right? And then the caveat will be, also write anything that isn't on that meal plan, you write it down. I don't care if it's a head of broccoli, you write it down. Because what you think is insignificant, what I think is insignificant might be very different, right? Then the glasses of, you get all the information you don't want, the one square of dark chocolate, the Skittle that their kid left on the table, right? They don't matter. The coffee, and then you see 4 coffees with whatever amount of creamer and 3 sugars a day, the Starbucks fudge triple latte, all of that stuff gets written down. And then okay, here we are. That's fine. And again, in that scenario, if this is a controlled variable, so let's say there's stuff here, like this is like date night, right? This is like 2 coffees a day with creamer. This is, then you start getting questions like, can I have ketchup, right? If these are a constant, that's fine. They're a constant. They aren't in part of the diet. I control this bit over here. I adjust this bit because I know this is constant. It doesn't mean they have to cut them out, but if things are like coming in and out regularly, that's when life becomes difficult. But that would be my process there. This is a meal plan. For 2 weeks, just give me 2 weeks. Eat X, Y, and Z for meal 1, 2, 3, whatever. And I'm not saying be a monk, but anything that isn't on this piece of paper or email, whatever, you just write it down. Just give me the information. No judgment, whatever, just do it. Exactly. And then you can say, well, this stuff can't really stay in. I'm sorry. Or you can say, oh, okay. Do you do that every week? Are you going to Starbucks every morning to get that coffee with 150 calories in it? Cool. Keep that in. I can deal with this over here. Unless you're trying to get on stage or something, that's not a big deal. But the bigger deal is actually having the information to work with. So that's why I'd always err on the side of being too strict to start. But you have to do it in kind of an open way where it's like, look, I'm not asking you to do this because I'm going to crucify you for it. We just need to see what this actually looks like. And
do something that fits your life.
Yeah, exactly. And then they understand. Like, you will get questions like, is rice a carb? Like, that happens, right? Like, but again, for us, we're like, what? To them, different learning process. Some of the biggest problems we have with coaching, and I'm as at fault at it as everyone else will be, is we just assume everyone knows training and diet. We assume everyone knows RPE. We assume everyone knows macros. We assume everyone knows that their Starbucks Grand Fudge Triple Latte has 10,000 calories in it. They don't know. But that's fine. That's just a learning experience for you both in that scenario. And now you're on the same page. Now it can be successful in the long run, right? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. So this is where most people need to be if they're gaining. I would even go more towards this, but most people don't like eating that low of a surplus because it still kind of feels like you're dieting, unfortunately. This is where food quality and stuff comes in. You can be amazed at how much food you can get at 1 to 200 calorie surplus if your food choices are very good. Okay. Now, in a gaining phase, we've already mentioned weekly average. This is a quick little matrix you can use to adjust your calorie intake based on your weekly average change or not. So if you gained up to a pound, that would be the absolute upper limit in weekly average, and we wouldn't want to see that long term. It means you probably don't need to change anything. You're on target, fine. If you're losing weight, obviously that means we would need to adjust calories up. And then if we're gaining too fast, these are percentages that you would use to drop off. Now, these might not eradicate the issue, should we say, straight like, if this person is gaining 2 pounds or more a week and we drop 10%, they might still gain the next week, but that's fine. Then let's say they only gain 1 to 1.5 this week, we reduce another 5%. It's better to go, let's just remember, if you're doing a diet plan for someone, you're coaching someone, or even you're coaching yourself, what you're paying for or what you're getting results from is how the diet is adjusted weekly, ideally, if they need to, which would mean you're better off being conservative here and adjusting on week 1 and adjusting on week 2 and adjusting on week 3, as opposed to doing this huge drop on week 1. Why? Because you'll probably overshoot and then you have to adjust again. And that's going to, imagine being on the receiving end of that 20% drop in calories. That's pretty shitty, right? And there could well be factors here that were outside of diet that led to it. Stressful work week, they flew somewhere, whatever it might be, this might not be 2 pounds of actual weight gain. So these are a little bit conservative precisely for that reason. If you follow this, don't be surprised if you need to adjust it twice. Better to be conservative with these changes. Okay. Let's start talking macros. Any questions about calorie intake based on that? Are we good? Okay. Right, macros. So we've already discussed 2 to 3 grams per kilos of lean body mass basically puts us at 1 gram per pound. I would argue you'd go on the higher end of that in a deficit because you're going to lose more protein to gluconeogenesis, i.e. making sugar out of protein. In your bulking phase, whatever gaining phase, you can be on the lower end of that because less of it will be lost. Now we have carbs and fats to play with. Carbs, all else being equal, for hypertrophy, are where you want your calories to go. Why? More mTOR, more insulin, more IGF-1, lower cortisol. Anabolic environment is going to be enhanced. More glycogen storage. It just makes sense, all else being equal, okay? That's not to say fats aren't important, but fats do not enhance any of these anabolic pathways. Fats need to be at a level that keep us healthy. And that's maybe more than you think, but beyond that, should we say, normal kind of constant level, there isn't a particular benefit from an anabolic point of view or hypertrophy point of view for fats going higher, other than there is more calories available. Carbs, however, have a direct response on a lot of the signaling pathways that we want, in the same way that leucine and amino acids do. Carbs are the most anabolic thing you can eat, separate to protein, okay? So that's why we would generally favor carbs, all else being equal. But there's a caveat. There's always a caveat, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And we'll discuss that now when we look at peri-workout nutrition. So this is just an example that you can use to break it down, right? We've got 100, I make nice round numbers because math, right? 100 kilo body weight individual at 10% body fat has 90 kilos of lean body mass, right? We're going for a lean bulk, which means we need just a small increase. So we estimate 12.5 calories per pound, puts us at 2750. We add a couple of hundred to that for a lean bulk, that puts us here. If they're 90 kilos of lean body mass, that means we need 225 grams of protein, and then the rest can be split really how we want. It's simple enough, right? Obviously, we don't have exact measures for body fat for people, but again, you throw a dart, you get it in the right ballpark, and then you adjust from there. Protein's going to be pretty much on the head most of the time, and then you can tinker around with the rest. But this ratio here can be important, right? We discussed, if we just go back, it's going to be quite a few slides, I'm sorry. Higher fat diet will increase these things. Higher carb diet will increase these things. Some people are very dopamine dominant. And what I mean by that is when someone is dopamine dominant, it means they naturally don't produce very much of it, which makes them very sensitive to it. When we increase dopamine, they feel awesome. Okay? They're going to feel good on a lower carb. Maybe not keto, but a lower carb diet. A higher carb diet will make them feel sluggish. This person over here is going to feel better on high carb diet. Let's say they lack serotonin, they lack inhibitory neurotransmitters, they're naturally anxious, or they just live a high stress life and they need to suppress cortisol and adrenaline more. High carb diet is going to be great. Imagine taking an anxious person with high stress and going low carb and driving up adrenaline and cortisol more. But you're in a surplus, they're still going to feel terrible. And if you feel terrible, what's your adherence to the diet going to be? What's your workout performance going to be? What's your sleep going to be? You see how this is how it all. So all of that works. All of that math works. But this is where adherence and well-being and energy levels and workout performance come into it. It can be that simple, but in reality, when you're dealing with people, not with robots, this stuff probably matters more. Because if your training is terrible, well, what's going to happen to your muscle tissue? Okay? If you have low energy all the time, you're going to be craving things. You're going to want to eat more. You're going to be more tempted to break your diet, whatever the term might be. If your sleep is worse, so on and so forth. If you have someone who is following a diet plan that works in favor of their natural motivators, their neurotransmitter levels, etc., they're just going to feel better, which conveniently means they're usually going to work harder for longer, so on and so forth. All of this math, calorie intake is irrelevant in the face of someone not following it at the end of the day.
You said low anxious people probably would most likely do better in a low carb.
We went over the arousal curve yesterday, right? Right? Anxious people are here. This is performance up here. So this would be peak performance at the top. But when we say peak performance, that doesn't just like mean running 100 meters. It's peak cognition, well-being, the level of activation that we want, right?
So
That,
across many of their daily life activities.
yeah, that's you being able to focus at work, right? If you ever drank way too much coffee and then try to focus on something, doesn't matter what you're trying to focus on, you still can't focus, right? Naturally anxious people are here, which is why they drink coffee, they take caffeine, they go this way. They go low carb, which drives up adrenaline and cortisol. They go this way, right? They eat a high carb diet, which pushes adrenaline and cortisol down. They go this way. They feel really good. Let's take this guy, girl, whatever, here. We talked about the really relaxed, super lazy looking athlete who sits down here all the time, and then only on game day is there enough at stake that their adrenaline goes high enough to get them up here. That person on a high carb diet is going to go this way. They're going to be horizontal half the time. Super laid back. You put them on a low carb diet, adrenaline goes up to a good level, not constantly. On average, they are going to feel better cognitively, perform better in the gym, so on and so forth. This is exactly what we play around with when it comes to peri-workout nutrition, but it applies to the diet as a whole as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So like for like a low carb diet, would it matter like a weekly or on a daily basis?
Daily basis. Now but there are going to be varying degrees of low carb, right? So that could look like carb cycling with just more carbs on their training days or whatever, but the person has to live every day. They have to do their job every day. They have to be a dad every day or whatever. So this is still important. When we talk about peri-workout nutrition, we're talking about this, but we're talking about it in this scale here, at this point in their day. How do they feel right here, where they need to be physically at their best? That's all. But really, if we're looking at diet adherence over time, does it matter if you're beast mode in the gym, if you're feeling crap the other 23 hours of the day? Doesn't matter. They're not going to follow it, right? So, peri-workout nutrition is very much in vogue and has been for a while. There is a reason for that, okay? If we only get an hour or two in the gym, we want to create an environment where we can perform well. It doesn't matter if everything's working in our favor to perform well 2 hours after the workout is done, okay? We can talk about all the different reasons why, but what it really comes down to is this. How much adrenaline and cortisol is in the system at the time of the training event, okay? And how much does that person need or not to be here at that specific time and place, okay? That is as simple as it gets. Now, obviously, carbs are the main thing that people like to manipulate around workouts, right? Fuel is available. It also has the biggest impact on adrenaline and cortisol. But what happens to this guy? This guy here, right? The guy who's naturally super relaxed. You say to him, right, pre-workout, I want you to eat 100 grams of carbs from whatever, don't care. And then during your workout, I want you to have 75 grams more carbs. Where are they going to be? They're asleep on the bench between sets, right? This person, however, that might be a viable strategy, okay? So more is not better. And let's be clear, how much fuel do you actually need for your workout? It's probably less than you think, right? The main thing, whilst we are providing fuel, it's more this than it is making sure you have enough carbs to actually train, unless maybe you're in a super depleted state, close to a show, long dieting phases, whatever it might be, okay? Okay, so what do carbs around the workout potentially do? More fuel, yes, important, kind of. Decreases cortisol, which will lead to less catabolism, which is important, but again, the scale at which that happens in a 2-hour workout window is probably much smaller than we all like to think. Increased amino acid uptake, this can be important. Right? Most of the amino acids that get into your muscle tissue during exercise piggyback on the back of carbohydrates and insulin. So if we need amino acids to get into the muscle tissue, or rather we just want them to get in there as quick as possible around the workout, that's going to be considerably easier if carbs and electrolytes are present. And it helps us preserve our glycogen stores in the muscle. If blood sugar is readily available, I have no reason to break down muscle glycogen, which means I can probably do more workload before my performance starts to drop. But what if it causes adrenaline to drop? What if too many carbs pushes me away from neurological optimal performance? Maybe physically, in terms of glycogen, blood sugar, I'm raring to go. I'm ready to do a beast mode 50 set leg workout, but I'm on the verge of falling asleep because of this. Which one's going to be more important? That, okay? We can also get reactive hypoglycemia. Really common in people who take too many carbs, either pre, more likely during. What happens is you get this huge influx of carbs, right? Blood sugar does this. What does the body release to do something about that? Insulin. What does insulin do? Makes carbs do this, right? If this is a big spike, you release a lot of insulin. Your body doesn't know you're about to train, right? So now we've got two things pulling down blood sugar. We've got a huge spike in insulin causing pretty fast storage of blood sugar, and we're now doing 50-meter sled drags with 1 minute rest in between. What's that doing to your blood sugar? Both of those collectively tank your blood sugar, and you nearly pass out from hypoglycemia, but you ate 100 grams of carbs before you went in the gym. How on earth did this happen? It's really common. So too many carbs can actually lead to that. So that needs to be taken into account.
With it though.
Hmm?
If you take fats with your carbs before you work out,
That will make them absorb slower, but then they're also going to sit in the gut for longer, which is point 3. Bloating and distension, which usually around the workout window, most people are having like liquid carbs, right? If you want to avoid that, you need to water them down enough so that it basically doesn't taste good, to put it bluntly. If something is truly isotonic, it's pretty bland. What happens is you take your Gatorade powder, you get 600 mils of water in your shaker, and you go, right, I need 70 grams of carbs. Cool, boom. What happens is now you have this fluid in your gut that has way more concentration of carbs, salt, electrolytes, everything else. That pulls fluid out of the bloodstream into the gut. It goes the other way. So your gut distends. There's now more water in your stomach. So that plays a big part here. If you're making a workout drink, 5 or 6 grams of carbs per 100 mils. Go.
on the last slide, didn't it say that peri-workout carbs affect cortisol, thus causing an increase in adrenaline via conversion in noradrenaline? And over here it says
Decrease cortisol? Okay.
maybe 2 slides back.
There could be a spelling error.
Increases adrenaline via conversion of noradrenaline. And now 2 slides in the future, it says can decrease adrenaline thus.
If we release cortisol, we get more adrenaline,
Oh, okay.
right? If we eat more carbs, we get less cortisol. Does that make sense?
Yes, I missed that sentence right.
No, that's fine. So 5 to 6 grams of carbs per 100 mils, give or take, is where you're going to need to be, maybe even less in terms of your dilution of your workout drink to avoid this problem, right? So it's not going to taste great, which is why most isotonic drinks are not actually isotonic, because then you wouldn't buy them because they don't taste good. I'm sorry, like a shaker like I had there, 600, you put 20, 25 grams of carbs in that, you're not going to run into that problem. Sure, maybe you need to drink a little bit more during your workout, but you're probably not drinking enough anyway, okay? So this gets to a point now where there's a personality aspect here. There's also a workout aspect. What type of training are we doing? This is important, neurological activation. But if my workout is 30 work sets on cable machines and machines, how important is it that I have to be neurologically at my absolute peak to perform? Less. If I'm doing a power-based workout full of jumps and throws or maximal strength work, this is much more important. And also workload is going to be lower. So I probably don't need 50 grams of carbs to do a 3-rep max, but I might need 50 grams of carbs to do this. So this interplay is going to also be determined by the type of workload you're doing. If an athlete is doing nothing but jumps and throws and plyometrics, it's going to be low volume and very, very dependent on adrenaline and cortisol. Your strategy to get the most out of them in that workout will be different to the strategy that gets the most out of them if they're doing, say, 1 hypertrophy session a week. Performance will be very different. Likewise, if there's a mix, then you're going to fall in the middle. So if it's strength, performance, or power-based, you're going to go towards less carbohydrates because being up here is more important compared to sitting on a preacher curl bench. You do not need to be slamming caffeine, taking Nupept and alpha GPC to do your curls really well. But you might need to if you're going to do power snatches or broad jumps or 40-meter sprints. Does that make sense? So how neurological versus how muscular is the session and how much volume is included in the session. Those are going to determine how much you need also. Okay, general practices then, because you're like, well, what the fuck? Yes?
I only have like 25 minutes left on that card.
Mm-hmm.
How much?
I mean, we can just take a 2-minute break after this slide. Easy. I mean, really, this next slide's the important one anyway. Okay. So what do we do? These are your catch-all guidelines, okay? Pre-workout, if we are going to use carbs, and anyone can take like 20 to 30 grams and not have a huge issue here. We want fructose, generally speaking. Why? Fructose preferentially goes to the liver, which is why everyone's like, why would I take fructose? That's stupid, right? If your liver glycogen stores are not full, your body cares a lot more about that than if your biceps are not full of glycogen. Cares a lot more about your liver. So if liver glycogen is not full, we will liberate glycogen from elsewhere to make sure that it is. So that ensures that that isn't happening. If liver glycogen stores are already full, then guess what? The fructose doesn't go there. Then it will go to the muscle. So just fruit, 20 or 30 grams of carbs from fruit will work. We want sodium and electrolytes prior to the workout. If you're only taking them here, you're probably taking them at a time that's too late. Also, what happens to blood flow to your gut during a session? Downregulated. You're not going to absorb electrolytes as quick during as you will before. Put yourself in the best scenario possible. Now, you want to support whatever your main excitatory neurotransmitter means. What the fuck does that mean? Right. If you're an adrenaline junkie, you're a person who responds really well to stimulants, caffeine, etc. You want to keep the carbs lower to make sure adrenaline is high. If you are dopamine dominant, which generally means you're someone who is very competitive, is good at delayed rewards. If you get what I mean by that, you're happy to work hard for something to get a reward later on. It's generally going to be quick wins versus longer wins is how people are motivated. Dopamine dominant people are great with longer wins. Adrenaline driven people want stuff now, which is why they go paragliding and jumping off cliffs and cool stuff like that. If you're dopamine dominant, putting something like L-tyrosine, for example, even L-dopa, I have slides on this after, would help support that neurotransmitter being at a higher level when you go into your session. Intra-workout, we may need none if it's a low volume strength power session, but even if we don't, we can put things in like creatine, glutamine, EAAs, because where is blood flow primarily going during a workout? Muscle tissue. If there is a good time to take things like creatine, glutamine, and EAAs, it's going to be during your workout when we're preferentially shuttling things there. 5 to 10 grams of creatine, 5 to 10 grams of glutamine, depending on body size and all this type of thing. 5 grams of EAAs to make sure that we have a good nitrogen balance during our session. Is as complicated as it will ever need to be. I would put some electrolytes in there as well, just to keep you topped up with what you're losing. You should be sweating, I would hope. But this is you don't need more than that. Any fancy intra-workout formula that's got an ingredients list that's that long, they all have things in them that are nowhere near effective dosages, like L-tyrosine. You would take a gram to get any effect from it. These things will have 20 milligrams of L-tyrosine just to say it's in there. They could be made an argument for something like a vasodilator, beta-alanine, citrulline, malate, but that would still go here. Okay? Post-workout, unless you're training twice a day, carbs aren't that important. So providing the whole diet is in place. But let's say you train late at night and you're up here because you just had your beast mode leg session. Are you going to sleep 2 hours later? Probably not. So training late at night, or naturally anxious person, whatever it might be, will benefit from some post-workout carbs to stop them being wired afterwards. But it's not as important from a recovery aspect, right? If you take, let's say we can allocate 100 grams of carbs to our workout, would you rather have them here and perform better, or recover really well from the shit session you just had because you were really this is where the stimulus happens. Here, like I said, as long as we're not training twice a day, or we're not training 10 p.m. at night and then 6 a.m. the next morning, is not that important. I would replenish electrolytes, and if we're training late, or we just are worried about neurological recovery, we can put things like magnesium, glycine, taurine, things that are neurological inhibitors, things that will help slide you this way so that you're not on that buzz for ages after your workout. Does that make sense? It's better to bring your nervous system down than to worry about eating an extra 100 grams of carbs. That's going to cause you to recover faster. Okay, let's plow forward with nutrition. Okay, so recomping. We're just going to go over this super quick because it's like a popular subject, whatever. Okay, so theoretically it can't happen, right? Can't lose fat, gain muscle at the same time. One's a deficit, one's a surplus. We're kind of coming around to the fact that it's not strictly true, but also we could walk from here to Los Angeles. Probably not the best way to get to Los Angeles though, right? Yes, you can recomp, but it's painfully slow. If you're okay with that, because you're already in a position where you're happy with your physique. Say you're, again, most common situations for things like this are like fitness models who need to be in like good shape all year round. They can have a photo shoot at 4 weeks notice all year round. Recomping makes beautiful sense to them because they're already in the shape they need to be, but they're just trying to tweak it and get a tiny bit better every year. For the average person, it probably isn't the fastest approach, and they're going to probably get frustrated about it. And just like we spoke about with hypertrophy, it's hard to know whether, like, am I actually achieving hypertrophy because it's so slow. You don't know till it's too late whether it's worked or not. It's even worse with recomping because it's slower again, both fat loss and muscle gain, okay? So the reason that being in a deficit makes it hard to gain muscle is not because there is a calorie deficit. It is because it creates an environment that is less anabolic, okay? Like higher cortisol, higher AMPK, less insulin, less IGF-1, perhaps reduced performance in the gym. This is why muscle gain gets hard. And we've already discussed, like, it's pretty feeble how much muscle we can actually put on. And now we're reducing that further, or at least making it harder for ourselves. That's why this gets really difficult, okay? Physiologically, it's totally possible. But these are the scenarios where we generally see it. Beginners, they are so trainable, so sensitive to the training stimulus that it doesn't matter. If they're in a deficit, they get an incredibly sharp, acute response to training, loads of mTOR, IGF-1, all that good stuff. So it doesn't matter. People who are regaining lost muscle is easier, okay? Look up the Colorado experiment with Arthur Jones, look up Casey Vieda. It was not the Nautilus machines that made him gain 42 pounds of muscle, whatever it was in like 6 weeks. It's because he was chronically ill. I believe he nearly died, and he lost about 50 or 60 pounds. Then he came out of hospital, probably went back on his drug regime, and went back on a diet, and lo and behold, he put on all the satellite cells, the nuclear domains, all the things that basically when you want to increase your muscle size, you need nuclear domains that allow you to branch out and create new proteins in that area. That's the hard bit to make your body do. They're already there. So the network, if you like, the roads that bring all the amino acids, whatever, however you want to look at it, they're already there. Structurally, you have the foundation to just rebuild it. Okay?
Walmart, that's probably
Hmm?
a good example of that.
Very, very good one, yes. It also happens when people hit an epiphany and radically change their lifestyle. Because again, they're basically just a beginner. Let's say there's someone who used to train, has now become a dad, worked for the last decade and done nothing else. So then one day they look in the mirror and go, right, back to the gym 3-4 days a week, diet drastically improves, protein intake's gone up, they're a beginner in the gym, so on and so forth. All the things in their favor of muscle protein synthesis is going for them, despite them being in a deficit. We see it in very heavily overweight people. Why? Because their even though they're in a deficit, their calorie intake is very high. So even if you're in a deficit, if calorie intake is very high, these are dampened or less significant. So they've got less of a handicap to anabolism. And obviously, being on PEDs kind of helps. Otherwise, people wouldn't use them. So what we really see in recomping most of the time is looking more muscular because you keep all the muscle. You keep all the muscle that you've worked so hard for and then progressively lean out, okay? If you want to look big and muscular, usually you have to look reasonably small most of the time in clothes or whatever. Then when they step on stage, whatever, that's when you look big, right? That being lean, being smaller looks bigger in the right context. That's what you're seeing. So when they take their bathroom selfies 6 months later, that's what you're seeing. They haven't put really probably any muscle on at all. If they're really smart, they would do what the Hollywood actors do, and they know they only need to be topless. So they basically just train upper body like crazy whilst they recomp and just wear pants like this, and then they look great, okay? The people who get success from recomping are usually the people who have all these factors, that natural anabolic environment working in their favor for a start, and they're doing things like advanced variations of calorie cycling or carb cycling, where there's big fluctuations in intake, maximizing the anabolic response on the training days, maximizing the AMPK fat oxidation routes on the rest days. They're doing a lot of energy systems work, specific cardio to enhance this. The low, high intensity cardio all plays into how well you oxidize fat, how regularly. So when you do those rest days, you burn more fat and you spare glycogen, etc., etc. And there's supplementation use that can help enhance it too. It's a strategy that can be used. It's painfully slow, and it usually involves a level of dedication and structure that most people just don't want to do. So it's probably not a best strategy for very many people.